Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today is focused on the really formidable challenge of maintaining sustainable nutrition during your 20s. It's a life stage that the source material defines as, high energy and fast recovering, but also just profoundly chaotic and demanding.
It's a crucial context, for sure. And the material really forces us to grapple with a fundamental dilemma here. Does the success of, sustainable nutrition for young adults depend mostly on prioritizing flexibility and consistency, basically rejecting rigidity? Or does that perspective, that flexible view, unfairly minimize the necessary role of structure and control in establishing lasting health habits?
Well, I'm going to hold the position that the source material correctly diagnoses the problem. Most diet failures for this group are systemic failures, not individual ones. They fail because they are, and I'm quoting here, built on ideas that don't survive real life. So my argument is that we have to focus on deep consistency, on recovery, and just actively reject this idea that health requires stringent control or perfection.
And I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. I absolutely concede the chaos of the 20s, but I'd argue that the material risks, it risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater by conflating necessary foundational structure with destructive rigidity. My contention is that defined structure is often the essential learning tool for novices to manage that chaos, not just, surrender to it.
Okay, so let's try to operationalize our terms early on. When I say flexibility, I mean decoupling success from really rigid rules about food timing or specific choices. It's a model that's built for recovery. When you say structure, you seem to mean defined, measurable boundaries, so tracking, counting, specific restrictions that, while maybe informative, ultimately just clash with the irregular social life and, frankly, the limited budget of a young adult.
That's a useful distinction. When I advocate for structure, I am talking about using quantifiable metrics, whether that's caloric ranges or just macronutrient awareness, as a learning framework. It's about building that initial awareness that leads to informed decisions down the line. I think we need to debate the utility of that initial framework.
Okay, let's delve into the core mechanism of failure then. My position is that most plans collapse because of this clash between real life, the late nights, social pressure, tight budgets, and what the source calls the myth of the perfect diet. When a plan requires perfection, missing one workout or eating one unplanned meal, it just triggers this all-or-nothing psychological response, and that leads to the collapse of the entire enterprise.
That is a powerful mechanism, I agree. Yet I worry your conclusion inadvertently dismisses the power of metrics for learning. You're arguing that structure inherently demands perfection. But what if a plan built entirely on these highly flexible principles gives the novice too vague of a compass? How does a young adult learn the calorie density of highly processed foods or the protein required for satiety without any initial measurable framework? The goal of discipline is to be able to eat well most of the time, but you first have to define what eating well even means.
See, the problem is that the definition of eating well that these rigid diets provide is just too fragile. The material highlights that the biggest driver of quitting is the feeling that, quote, normal life suddenly turns into failure. If the goal is sustainable behavior, the plan has to be simple, predictable, and this is crucial, guilt-free. We have to aim for consistency over intensity. The only structure we need is one that survives the chaos, not one that shatters at the first sign of it.
Okay. I hear the focus on guilt-free eating, but my concern is that prioritizing psychological comfort over that initial accountability can really slow down the learning process. You mentioned the young adult who hits a chaotic week, a late-night work deadline, a weekend wedding. The rigid rules break, yes, but I question whether a plan defined primarily by high flexibility actually provides the necessary resilience for recovery.
But resilience doesn't come from tracking numbers. It comes from decoupling failure from the moment.
Okay, but allow me to challenge that decoupling. If you have clear, structured, maybe minimal boundaries, let's just say an awareness of your daily caloric threshold. When life gets messy, you know precisely where the line is and how to course correct the next morning. Control, in this sense, provides the resilience to return to a known structure. A completely flexible approach risks allowing the chaos to just fully derail your efforts. because the boundary lines were too vague to even define a return point.
I think that framing suggests that resilience only comes from counting. And I would argue that sustainable resilience is behavioral. The source suggests focusing on simple habits, aim for 30 grams of protein at breakfast, or prioritize hydration and regular meal timing, not tracking total calories for the day. That simple structure survives even if breakfast is a protein shake from a convenience store on the run. That foundation supports your energy and mood, and it ensures health remains a supportive foundation, not some cognitive challenge.
That shift to behavioral goals, protein, hydration, that's compelling. But it does force us to address how the source material defines structure and restriction more broadly. The material seems to generalize legitimate caloric or macro management, like cutting processed carbs or managing fat intake, as necessarily bad. It says many plans are just restriction disguised as health.
Well, we have to look at the psychological and the biological outcome. The source material argues that true restriction, the kind that asks for detailed tracking and severe cuts, it backfires. It's due to fundamental biology. When the body interprets a dramatic calorie or nutrient cut, especially for a young active adult, it responds as if it's under a threat, not a wellness plan.
I agree that severe restriction leads to negative outcomes, but is every form of intake management automatically a threat? I maintain that we're conflating necessary energy management with, starvation dieting. For many young adults who are transitioning from a totally unstructured life, maybe eating fast food constantly, relying on energy drinks, understanding their basic caloric needs and managing their intake of, say, refined sugar is a critical initial structure. It provides awareness, not restriction.
But that awareness comes at a cost, which is precisely the failure point the material targets: cognitive drain. The psychological strain of constantly tracking, constantly monitoring, it undermines the very goals of sustained health. The focus on biological backfire is key here. Stress related to dieting shows up as, quote, brain fog, irritability, poor sleep, and low motivation. When you're in your 20s, trying to build a career and a social life and an identity, a plan that requires constant cognitive effort and undermines your mental clarity is, well, it's actively damaging. Biology always wins, and it fights back against constant cognitive restraint.
That is an excellent point regarding mental energy, and I accept that cognitive drain is a massive barrier in this demanding decade. However, let's consider the duration of this structure. What if the initial structure isn't framed as a permanent diet, but as a short-term intensive educational tool? Say, 3 weeks of awareness tracking designed specifically to help a novice understand macro ratios or calorie density, followed by a transition to the behavioral model you're championing. Does that initial control still trigger the biological threat response if it's temporary and framed as learning?
The research suggests that for many people who are prone to disordered eating or perfectionism, and that's a high percentage in this age group, even temporary detailed tracking can initiate that negative cycle of guilt and rigidity. We're looking for a universal, sustainable model. The path of least resistance, which is consistency and flexibility, avoids the risk of initiating that psychological fragility entirely. Why even introduce the tool of control if the goal is to ultimately discard it?
Because you have to understand the mechanics before you can drive intuitively. Trusting your body instead of fighting it, that's a key concept from the material, is a highly advanced skill. It's the goal of nutritional maturity, not the starting point. I worry that by dismissing that initial phase of structured learning too easily, the flexible model lacks the actionable roadmap that a novice needs to internalize what consistency even feels like physiologically.
But what if we define consistency not by what is measured, but by what is felt? The goal, as the source proposes, is achieving health through eating meals that keep you full and foods you actually enjoy, making eating feel, quote, boring in the best way. This minimizes that psychological burden of guilt.
I understand the desire for guilt-free and enjoyable eating, but let's address the practical barriers here. How feasible is it to consistently prioritize enjoyment when you're dealing with a limited budget, chaotic timelines, constant social pressures? Does prioritizing enjoyment mean you have to rely on expensive, high-quality ingredients?
Not at all. The sustainability comes from reliability, not cost.
Boring in the best way means finding staples like eggs, oats, simple legumes, reliable high-protein frozen meals that are inexpensive, easy to prepare, and predictable in how they affect your satiety and energy. The enjoyment is just about finding foods you don't feel guilty about that provide the fuel you need without this massive cognitive effort.
But even then, without an initial structural framework, how do we prevent the avoidance of control from just becoming an avoidance of accountability? Let's take the scenario of the young professional flying cross-country for a 48-hour client trip. In that scenario, your definition of flexibility means what? Ordering the healthiest option on the room service menu, or just finding a reliable source of protein, regardless of its health label?
It means choosing the reliable source of protein. My accountability is, did I select a meal that supported my immediate energy needs and mood, allowing me to succeed at my professional task? It's not, did I meet my exact macro count for the day? The flexible structure survives the trip. The hyper-rigid meal prep plan doesn't.
I agree that the survival of the structure is paramount, but I have to press on the learning curve. If we rely solely on intuitive choice from the beginning without an initial benchmark, how does the novice distinguish between a true physiological need, say hunger due to a lack of protein, and a craving triggered by poor sleep or social habit? That ability to differentiate often comes from an initial period of defined, structured observation. You need the metrics to calibrate the intuition.
The calibration happens through feedback loops that are far simpler than tracking. Did you sleep well? Did you have energy in the afternoon? Were you irritable? If the answer is no, the plan failed, and the course correction is simple. Add more protein or fiber to the next meal. This bypasses the need for the mathematical precision that just falls apart under real-life pressure. That simple, repeatable consistency is the only viable structure for this chaotic decade.
I appreciate the clarification. I mean, if we agree that structure means establishing those simple behavioral boundaries, focus on feeling full, focus on enjoyment, focus on protein, then we certainly converge on the goal. But if we define structure as the necessary initial use of defined, measurable control to calibrate the body's signals, then I maintain the material dismisses a powerful, albeit temporary, educational tool that should precede radical flexibility.
And my rejection of that initial, measurable control stems from the evidence that it just too quickly leads to the psychological collapse, the rigidity that we're trying to avoid. The focus has to remain on the model that works for, real humans with real lives.
So the core tension remains compelling. The advocate argues that diet failure is primarily a failure of the rigid model, which fails to account for chaos in reality. And your solution is to prioritize flexibility and consistency to ensure health is a supportive, guilt-free foundation.
Exactly. We have to make health a foundation, not a temporary, unsustainable phase. It must support your overall energy and mood, allowing you to actually excel in your career and personal life.
And I'll restate that. While flexibility is crucial for long-term survival in a chaotic life, initial structure shouldn't be viewed as the enemy, but as a temporary framework. Long-term success requires finding a balance where that defined control establishes necessary awareness, enabling the subsequent trust and consistency required to truly eat well most of the time.
The material certainly illuminates the difficult tension between an ideal nutritional plan and the demanding, chaotic reality of life in one's 20s.
Indeed, it forces us to consider whether achieving sustained, consistent nutrition requires a detailed map to start the journey, or if a reliable, highly flexible compass is enough from the very beginning.